We talked last with Professor Peter Wielhouwer from the Western Michigan University Political Science Department, I think just after the election, and haven't checked in since, and so thought maybe we'd take this time today to do so. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Richard. I've missed you.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've been completely bored after the election. All the excitement just stopped, didn't it?
That's it.
Not really.
No more news.
Yeah, all done.
All done.
Boy, this is an interesting situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about somewhere in this segment with you about how to break through the noise, and I don't know if anybody has the answer to that. But how do you look at this setup right now? There is so much noise, so much politically charged noise from one side or another that you really got to work to break through this. Do you think so? Do you think that's true?
I do think it's true. What I've been telling my students is that they need to really be careful that they're getting their news from a variety of different sources. We have a tendency to only seek out those news sources that tend to make us feel comfortable and reaffirm what we already believe. And there's nothing wrong with getting some information from that, but it's also good to hear from the other side occasionally. So I encourage my students to analyze what their own media sources are and then go find something that's different, that comes at the news from a different angle. For my conservative students, that might mean going to NPR or watching MSNBC occasionally. For my liberal students, it might mean tuning into Fox News or listening to Mark Levin or Rush Limbaugh for a little while. And so I think it's important for us to get these different perspectives. It also helps us to think through what people around us are thinking and how they're viewing the world. It helps make us better neighbors, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, though, because it used to be that you went to a source that was supposed to leave all the bias out or leave all the bends out of these things. BENDS, not BENZ. So do we just not find that anymore? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think that there are sources that are out there that are relatively objective. If you think about major news organizations that really put a lot of time and effort into fact gathering and help to distinguish their stories based upon whether they're reporting facts or whether they're analyzing news or whether the articles that you're seeing are opinions. I think, educating ourselves about the different kinds of stories that are out there and then being discerning when we're reading those stories, even if it's on a relatively objective and authoritative source like the New York Times or something like that, you've got to understand what it is that you're reading. Mm-hmm. And everybody ought to just kind of understand that even the reporters doing their best work, they're coming at their reporting, they're coming at their journalism from a particular perspective, and they don't always ask the kinds of questions in a way that everybody's going to be interested in. So I think that just being aware of not only how stories get portrayed and framed, but also, what are the assumptions that reporters have, what questions are they not asking, and then trying to find information that will answer those questions.
We're here with Professor Peter Wielhouwer this half hour on 95.3 WBCK. Back in a moment to talk a little bit more about this. And interestingly, I watched the 50 years of the Tom Brokaw career that Dateline aired recently. And Tom Brokaw talked about this, too, and I'll share with you what he said about this coming up in just a minute on 95.3 WBCK. Richard Piet Show this half hour with Professor Peter Wielhouwer, Political Science Department at WMU, checked in with us quite a lot over the run-up to the election and a little bit after, and it's been a while since we've talked. Before we talk a little bit about your impressions of what's gone on in the Trump administration up to now, let me just make a couple more assertions on what we were just talking about, trying to cut through the noise, right? So Brokaw was doing a retrospective on his 50 years of covering news, and somebody asked him about this, and he said, you wouldn't believe the amount of people who come up to me and say, you know what I read on the internet? Or you won't believe what I read on the internet. And Tom said, no, I won't believe what you read on the internet. And his point was what you're saying, which is you've just got to really apply your good sense to this. And the way he put it was apply the same research that you would on the internet buying a new car or buying a flat screen TV or that sort of thing. You've got to look at the information in front of you and analyze it and understand where it comes from.
Well, there's something to that, but we have to have a bit of a reality check here. Most folks are just not willing to put in the time, put in an hour's worth of time to research the validity of a story. The relative importance of a single story to what they're spreading or what they're hearing is just not that important. So whereas the amount of research that it takes to buy a car, that matters a lot because you're going to be dealing with that day in and day out. So I think that there's a certain level of intellectual shortcuts that we take in terms of finding information sources that we find credible. And what psychological research shows us is that we tend to find sources to be credible when they largely reinforce what we already think.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking on the internet, when we're looking at a Facebook feed or something like that, our tendency is to positively respond to stories that confirm what we already believe, and to negatively respond to stories that we already would think to be skeptical about. So that it does take a few minutes to really think through and look at whether the sources are credible, and that's a time-consuming process.
Yep.
If you're going to do that in any depth.
Right. Nobody said it was going to be easier.
Right, and we've all got important things to do, right? We've all got things that are pressing on our schedules, and so the advice that I give is if you're going to be sharing news, if you see something come across your Facebook feed, it riles you up, kind of hooks you emotionally. Before you forward that on, think through it and look at the credibility of the source. And there's not a lot we can do about the sources that come to us, but there's a lot that we can do about the information that we send forward to others, in the people in our circles. And so, each one of us has some credibility with a group of people. Just keep in mind that people are listening to you when you're spreading information.
Yeah. That was the other thing Brokaw said alarmed him the most, is that we as consumers of media now, because of these divisions, now want our points of view validated more than we've ever wanted before.
Well, not just more than we've wanted, but more than we've had the capability to do.
Right.
The ability for me to spread information immediately to 300, 400 people simply hasn't existed for most people for all of human history. And now all of a sudden it does, and it happens with almost no forethought about the impact of it. So this really is it's a transformative time in terms of the ability of individuals to spread information, or whether that information is correct or incorrect.
Professor Peter Wielhouwer with us, and will continue to be for a few more minutes. With Professor Peter Wielhouwer, Poli-Sci Department at Western Michigan University. So I guess the big story, a couple of big stories right now around the Trump administration. One of them is the Supreme Court nominee will likely be decided soon, and there's going to be some wrangling to get it done, it seems.
It seems that way. The latest news seems to be that the Democrats have enough votes in order to prevent a final vote, that is, to block the bringing of a final vote under the current Senate rules, which many people understand as being related to something called the filibuster, the ability of a minority of at least 40 members of the Senate to block what the majority wants to get done. So the challenge is that in the current context, the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has committed to confirming Gorsuch, and even if that includes having to change this long-standing Senate rule. So it'll be very interesting to see whether the brinksmanship that has been characterizing congressional politics over the last 15 years or so, if it finally comes to a head this week, and we see the dismantling of that 60-vote filibuster rule.
The run-up to the election really characterized this issue, the Supreme Court nominee, as perhaps one of the top issues, the most valuable reasons why the Republicans or the Democrats were interested in being successful on Election Day because they had control over this. Of course, President Obama tried to make a nomination. It didn't go anywhere. So do you still see it that way today?
Oh, for sure. I think that when we look at why people voted the way they did, that there is a very large chunk of people who voted for Donald Trump who weren't very happy about him personally, but who felt very strongly about the importance of having a conservative to be nominated for the Supreme Court. And so they were voting as much against Hillary Clinton in whatever potential nominee she would put forward as they were voting for Trump, who had promised to nominate a conservative. He followed through on that promise, and so then the challenge is once this situation this week with Gorsuch gets resolved, where does the court go from here? Where does he go from here? Does he continue to nominate conservatives, or does he moderate somewhat to try to get along a little bit better with the Democrats?
Speaking of trying to cut through the noise, what do you make of all this Russia talk? Is this noise, or is there really something going on there?
Well, that's really complex, and a lot of it because we're dealing with our intelligence agencies and our spy agencies. I'm pretty sure that we don't have all the information. It does seem to be pretty much consensus that Paul Manafort, who was an important player in the Trump campaign in the spring and early summer, there's no question that he has extensive Russian contacts. And what that meant for the campaign at the time and what it means for the Trump administration now is not entirely clear. I think this is something that's going to just take time to roll out and unravel. We may or may not ever know what the final take on this is, what the real truth is. I mean, sometimes these things simply don't get out because they are sensitive matters of national security. Mm-hmm. We might not know until the Trump papers are released in 30 years. Who knows?
Right. And if there is something there, the Trump detractors like to say this is impeachable stuff. Do you see it that way?
Well, I have not personally seen the claims that people are saying are impeachable. Yeah. I don't know about that.
The claim, the overall tenor of this administration is obviously much different than, in some ways, than we've ever seen. How do you talk about that with your students?
Well, on one level, I point out, as many of my colleagues do, that the way that Trump acts as a president is not really normal. I mean, he does not behave the way that historically we've come to expect presidents to act in terms of his demeanor, in terms of his at least pretending to be collegial with people that he doesn't have to be collegial with. That's kind of normal, polite politics, and that pretty much is not the way he does business. So in some sense, things are not normal in the way that he acts. On the other hand, some things are extraordinarily normal. His desire to accomplish certain things, the agenda that he sets in motion, that falls under the normal kinds of pressures and constraints that every president has to face. He has to deal with Congress. Sure, he wants to build a wall, and even if it's a literal wall, he doesn't actually have any authority to raise money and spend money to do it without congressional action. And so he has to work with Congress to accomplish many of the things that he said that he wants to do, but that are not within his power to do. He certainly saw that with the Affordable Care Act, attempt to repeal that he's under the same constraints that presidents have always been under. And the system was put in place precisely to prevent against leaders like Donald Trump, if you don't like Donald Trump, or precisely put in place to control leaders like Barack Obama if you didn't like Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the nature of the system, is pressure from the other branches to force cooperation if you want to get anything done.
Right, and speaking of cooperation or lack thereof, what do you make of this Trump administration, Amash, Freedom Caucus stuff?
Well, I think that we have to remember that from an ideological perspective, Donald Trump is not particularly conservative. He has some conservative issues, but even during the campaign, conservatives were not really in love with Donald Trump's positions. He's a lifelong Democrat. He's a New York Republican at best, which is not terribly conservative. So when he was trying to cooperate with Congress and get stuff really rammed through Congress. He ran into true conservatives in the Freedom Caucus and true libertarians like Justin Amash, who basically said this is a non-starter because this does not actually do what we said we wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to have to work with them if he wants to get things done. His only other option is to try to find common ground with some Democrats, and ideologically he can do that, but the question is whether any Democrats would actually be willing to work with him in order to give him what we might call a win in the legislative arena. It's difficult to see a path forward for him without working with the conservatives.
Yeah. The approach, though, instead of extending some sort of olive branch to Amash and his colleagues, is to say, I got to get that guy out of there and rattle him first, which is sort of a business approach, I guess.
It is, but he's trying to do that with people over whom he has no power.
Yeah.
Because each of them is independently elected. From what I've been reading is that they're all terribly popular in their own districts. And the prospects of trying to defeat a conservative, popular member of Congress who are you going to get to compete against them when they're already super conservative, really representative in relatively gerrymandered districts? I mean, there's just not a lot of power behind his threat aside from the bully pulpit, and it's not clear that would have much of an influence on congressional races.
All right. Well, onward we go. And thank you for the thoughts, Peter.
My pleasure.
Peter Wielhouwer, professor of political science at WMU, 95.3 WBCK.